Hello and welcome to The Big Picture, where today we focus on US President Donald Trump's just concluded trip to Saudi Arabia. Ties between the two countries go back to the end of the Second World War, and the relationship has evolved over the decades. Now, needless to say, Trump's choice of heading to Riyadh first raised several eyebrows. Now, in what's being called a new era of US-Saudi Arabian relations, Trump signed a joint strategic vision that includes $110 billion in American arms sales and other new investments that the administration said would bring hundreds of thousands of jobs to the US. Now, on the strategic front, US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson also pledged a hardline stance on Iran. Now, joining us on the show today to discuss the developments and its implications worldwide, we have former Ambassador Meera Shankar joining us here, retired Commodore Uday Bhaskar, Director of Society for Policy Studies, Professor K.P. Vijayalakshmi from SIS American Studies at JNU, and diplomatic editor of The Hindu, Suhasini Haidar as well. Thank you all of you for joining me here on the show. Let me start with you, Ambassador ma'am, and what are your takeaways of this trip and what struck you the most?
Well, takeaways. First, I think there's been a reset of US-Saudi Arabia relations, and in fact the USA's relations with all the Gulf countries, because President Obama had sought to move ahead on the nuclear deal with Iran, which was opposed by Saudi Arabia. And there were tensions between the US and Saudi Arabia, including over Syria and Iran. What Mr. Trump has done is to, go back to the pre-nuclear deal policy which the US was following of isolating Iran. And he has urged that the countries in the Middle East should create a coalition to fight terrorism emanating from Iran, and has even talked of the Iranian people being waiting for the day when the Iranian people will have the regime that they deserve, which hints at regime change. The second thing, of course, was that business was the main focus of the summit, apart from the geopolitics of isolating Iran. And other than the $110 billion in armament sales, there are also deals variously described as 300 billion, 350 billion, 375 billion, and the Iranians say over 400 billion. So, but a very large amount of business has been transacted, including between the Saudi company Aramco and major US companies such as GE and Halliburton and so on. The third thing is that President Trump said that he would not, prescribe, the US would not prescribe to others what they should do, how they should live. So in a sense, saying that there will be no criticism of the Gulf countries for the kind of governments that they have or their human rights record, which again would be somewhat of a change, because most US governments have been very chary of criticizing the Saudi human rights record.
Okay.
Finally, of course, Mr. Trump flew from Saudi Arabia to Israel directly, without making any stopover. And while this has been done by others in the past, including when there was shuttle diplomacy, it hasn't been done in such a public way, and most have made some kind of a token halt somewhere en route to Israel. Clearly, Israel's relationship with the Gulf countries has become much closer, even though there may not be formal relations, but it's become much closer because of their shared antagonism towards Iran. The US has, Mr. Tillerson has said that the US will keep sanctions. I don't know whether these are the sanctions imposed by the nuclear deal or these will be fresh sanctions because of Iran fomenting, sectarian strife and terrorism, and unless it kind of withdraws from its assistance to groups in Yemen, Lebanon, and Syria.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Do you agree, Professor, that the relationship that that Ambassador Ma'am is talking about, it's a reset of sort in the case of US and Saudi Arabia, or for the matter, some, of course, in the press there in the US as well, saying that this is perhaps a new era that we're seeing of relationships between both the countries. Do you agree with that?
It's certainly a departure, and I would say it's a redial in some ways, because US Saudi Arabian relations have been very close, and Saudi Arabia is an ally of the United States. The first takeaway that you get from this particular meeting is this is the first formal or official foreign trip, and the Islamophobia that was characteristic of Mr. Trump and his advisors,
Yes.
Steve Bannon and others, that was in the limelight. You're seeing a resetting of that as well, and I do agree with Meera when you say that there is a rethinking and publicly
Yes.
sort of affirming that this is going to be our new focus,
Yes.
and sympathy would be very different. The second major takeaway is also that, after all, he has repeatedly said, Mr. Trump has repeatedly said, excuse me, that he's a businessman and there are economic interests that the United States has been neglecting for a long period of time. So even his travel ban
Yeah.
has impacted tourism, because a lot of tourists do come from Islamic countries to America,
Yes.
and that has been one of the industry's gripe, and said that this has really affected us, and so on and so forth. And on economics, one is of course on foreign policy, the second is on economics, the third is on strategic regional calculus, altering that, and the fourth of course is political relations.
Yes.
So there are 4 segments to this trip.
Yeah.
So the regional calculus has been Iran, on which again Ambassador Shankar, I'll have to agree, except that I would say that Saudi Arabia is also trying. I mean, why would they put themselves out for Mr. Trump? And I see this because I think Saudi Arabia is trying to end its own isolation, isolation.
Yeah, the
inside
reception, the
region.
welcome was very different from what they
and
they
this
gave
is
Obama.
a person who
Yes.
said all those things.
Yes.
So, despite that, the
That's
sword
right.
dance.
That's right. Yes.
So I would say Saudi Arabia is also doing a redial. And they're saying, okay, let's, put Iran back into its box. And that's a public avowal
Yeah.
of engaging more deeply and more conscientiously with each other. And on economics, I would say, well, they are the third largest trading partner. The Islamic bloc are the third largest, after China and Europe and others. So you're seeing trade and investment, as again Ambassador Shankar mentioned. I think there's a large picture to be understood from this visit. You see commitment to infrastructure, more than 300 billion, I
Yes.
think, and so on and so forth. So, but on the strategic front, and I think Commodore will probably help us with more specific details, but the ones that I have are quite clear that, one of the key reasons why this relationship has been publicly affirmed is also for the military sales and the shoring up of their military bases. After all, the 5th Fleet is in Bahrain and Qatar, so that, is a particular takeaway. So you need to see all of this in a sort of a overall picture, I would say. So you have the ending of the Islamophobia that went on during the campaign and the resetting for that.
Yes.
Then you have the economics helping explain the reason of change. Jobs. I'm
Yes.
getting what I
And Saudi
promised,
Arabia changing its
And the
strategy
third
as well.
is Saudi Arabia changing the strategy, and the cause is to isolate Iran and put Iran into a box.
Taking
Syria
the
has
Iran-
been one of
yes.
those other areas, and Yemen. Saudi Arabia by itself was finding this difficult, and GIC countries have also been promised and are in the process of concluding several agreements and so on. So I think you're seeing a whole package
Yeah.
that is coming out of this trip.
Okay.
And hence this
Yes.
trip is very much more seen as very fundamental to US foreign policy.
In that
and
manner.
a
All right.
Trump's foreign policy.
Commodore
as well.
Bhaskar, talking about Iran now, it's ironic that while that meeting took place, we had Hassan Rouhani winning an election, and the main plank of his election was, of course, that nuclear deal, and how he's the moderate voice. He's, of course, opening up more avenues for Iranians, but suddenly it seems like like being pointed out, he's been put back into that box. The country's been put back into that box. And this was a very important, do you think, strategy-wise, from the US, at least as far as Trump's policies are concerned, and also for the Saudi Arabians, or for that matter, the Arab nations?
Well, actually, Tracy, I would link this with President Trump's domestic priorities, meaning that this is his first foreign visit. And I think, just to extend the point that Vijayalakshmi made, there was a certain image and a perception about what Donald Trump stood for.
Yeah.
And one of them, of course, was a sense that he was anti-Islam. So if you look at the speech, he tried very hard to project the equivalent of a soft interpretation of Islam. But more than that, I think on the domestic agenda, to me, there were two strands that play out in the speech. One is the Republican Party traditionally was unhappy or uncomfortable with the so-called Obama opening to Iran. And they felt that too much was given away to Iran. So to that extent, I think he was also appeasing that particular sentiment within the United States, which feels that Iran, as you said, should be boxed in. Whether they'll be successful or not is a different point, but I think that was an important aspect of what I would call as the domestic compulsion for Mr. Trump as an individual. The second, which I think is a bit over the top, was what you said in the initial remarks, that in the speech, he talks about, I think as Meera said, whether it's $110 billion or $300 billion or $350, it's indeterminate.
Yes.
But for the American voter who voted for Trump, this is like, here is a man who gets you a good deal. It's almost $500 billion by the time he goes back. Now we are living in a state where for the American media, which is supportive of Trump, facts don't matter.
Yes.
So they will package this as $500 billion. And one line in the speech was hundreds of thousands of jobs.
Yes.
That is truly over the top.
Yes.
You know, for the United States to suggest that one visit to Saudi Arabia and Donald Trump comes back with hundreds of thousands of jobs, particularly in the Midwest or wherever, I think is another strand. So these two, to my mind, are domestic. I think on the regional grid, one sense I came back, and this was slightly disappointing for me as an analyst, it seemed as if Donald Trump, the President of the United States, was again pandering, if you will, to what you might call as the Sunni bloc. Because when we talk about the US-Saudi relationship, remember 9/11. Post 9/11, many questions are being asked in the United States as to what was the identity of the perpetrators. So it went through a very, I would say...
And Trump himself had said that they were Saudis.
He drew attention to
Yes.
So I think that is one aspect. And my disappointment is the way in which the speech was framed. One is the sectarian dimension. The second is, at a time when you said Iran, it seemed, was reaching out, and Iran's own domestic politics is moving towards a more, quote-unquote, moderate kind of orientation, I think we have gone back. And this, I think, would play out in a way that could be detrimental to India, because Pakistan, again, you know, given General Rahil Sharif, the so-called Arab NATO, etc., has a subtext that could have adversarial implications, at least as far as the region is concerned. And that is my disappointment, that President Trump, in pandering to, whether it's the domestic compulsion or whatever be the Saudi pressure on him, has brought back a binary which I think was avoidable.
Okay. So Hasini, coming to you now, you know, this particular trip, and which is of course a long one, and you know, there's still a lot more to go for this trip. But you know, as far as Saudi Arabia is concerned, you know, choosing it as the first country of his overseas visit, you know, and this was the first time perhaps the world is actually seeing President Trump as a world leader, because, you know, all this while we've been seeing him in his own little comfort zone across the US. You know, how did he measure up, according to you? The choice, of course, was interesting, and we're, of course, seeing it unfold as the days go on. But apart from that, how did he measure up as a world leader, you know, as far as vis-a-vis his U-turns, really, on a lot of things that we saw during his speech in Saudi Arabia?
Well, Tracy, I'd certainly say that we saw President Donald Trump come into his own in Saudi Arabia, because this is what he does best. He does deals best. He's a businessman by his own admission. That's what he likes to make deals. And I think when we saw him certainly sitting across from the Saudi king, as well as during his talks with all the other Gulf countries and Islamic nations, I think we saw him at a comfort level that perhaps you don't even see back home. In fact, the US press was all full of the fact that he had sort of just brushed aside all the criticism back home. and in Saudi Arabia was being lauded. I'll come very quickly to the speech because I think that there is a lot in there that has to still be digested. And we need to also discuss not just what it means for the world, what it means for the America's policy, but what it means for us in India. Certainly, we are going to welcome the fact that he has chosen to name India amongst nations that are victims of terror. But of course, it was a laundry list of nations. He mentioned South America, he mentioned Russia, he mentioned China, he mentioned Australia, and in that context said India too has faced terror. He also said that the countries that have been hit the worst by terror are Middle East nations and Muslim countries. All that would be fine. He then went ahead to say that it is those countries, Islamic countries, for better, to describe all of them, because there were 4 South Asian nations as well as the Middle East over there.
Yes.
He said it's their responsibility to take on the terrorists in their midst. All of that India would be okay with. But then he went on to give this entire project to fight terror a very, very religious context. He spoke about the fact that if all Abrahamic faiths, what they call Kitabi religions, were to come together, there will be peace in the world. And he was referring very specifically to Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. I think that is the kind of thinking that us we in India would shy away from, and would certainly not find it helpful, particularly in the context of multicultural countries, countries which have more than one religion. He's certainly trying to find some kind of a mediatory place in the world, speaking about the fact that he's going to Israel, but he's also going to go to Bethlehem and meet with the Palestinian president. But when he tries to put a religious flavor to this uniting of the world, I think we are working into troubling territory over here. His comments about Iran then take on not just religious differentiation, but also sectarian differentiation.
Yes.
And the last point, which I think should be of concern, is that we have done away with the idea that regardless of the administration, America goes ahead. We are seeing a U-turn like nothing before. Remember, just 1 year ago, President Obama's officials were coming to India and telling India to do more with Iran,
yes,
to conduct more business with Iran.
That's
a
right.
year later, he's practically coming over here and saying, coming to Saudi Arabia and saying that Iran is a terror state and needs to be isolated. I think that is perhaps the one that sends out the greatest warning signals, not just around the world, but particularly here in India. We must understand that this was something that was considered a given, that regardless of the administration, regardless of the regime change, if you like, America's policies continued down a certain constant. Even if they moved, they would move ever so gently.
Yes.
I think for the first time, we're seeing very, very sharp U-turns here.
Commodore Bhaskar, you agree with that? Is that the takeaway that India should be looking at?
Yeah, I think for India, Tracy, I'd say, just to extend the point that Suhasini has made, one is, you remember, we had a certain tension in dealing with Iran going back to Bush 1 and Bush 2. And it is only after President Obama began what you might call as the rapprochement that we saw that there was some kind of, the situation became a little more malleable. So immediately I foresee a certain amount of a return of that tension as far as Iran's own locus in the region is concerned. And my own sense is that in the speech, while it was a kind of motherhood and apple pie,
Yes,
in terms of the so-called Trump vision, in terms of specifics, it appears that in not looking at the Saudi-Pakistani role, as far as the ideology of terror is concerned and the sectarian dimension, that to me, as I said, was the reason for this disappointment, because in the run-up, it seemed that the Trump team is going to be a little more, shall we say, realistic about what is it that the United States needs to grapple with. And the way in which I think that was glossed over, I mean, there was a reference to say that we do not expect that any of the countries seated here, the 55 nations there, will allow their soil to be used for terrorism, some reference to terror funding and so on.
Yes.
But the more, I would say, core kind of issue as to why is the region in the kind of turbulence and turmoil that is, we didn't get a sense of that. So I think that was glossed over, and we come back to this focus saying that I'll get you more jobs and we can all move towards greater prosperity, no more refugees, people will come here for a collective good. I mean, that is so far removed from the reality that you really say that this is some kind of cuckoo land that is being painted. So that was my reason for the disappointment, that the President of the United States has a very good team normally advising him.
Yes.
Clearly, that was not, shall we say, discernible in this speech.
Absolutely. If I was wanting to get to that, Ambassador Shankar, that when it comes to Trump, the amount of U-turns that he's really taken, you really don't know where he stands. Is that a sense that you still feel even after his first overseas visit? The very fact that now he's going to be heading to, yes, Israel, Palestine, of course, but he's going to be going to NATO, he's going to be going to he'll be meeting EU leaders, there's the G7 as well. You know, how do we take it? I mean, is this something that has to be taken cautiously, or is this really going to be the stand of the country? I mean, how is it to actually see what Trump says?
I think we have to wait and see, given the number of U-turns that have occurred, particularly in the field of foreign policy. In the field of domestic policy, the courts or others may have thwarted what he wanted to do.
Yes.
But the U-turns have been very much more visible in the field of foreign policy. And while unpredictability perhaps can be, you know, a negotiating plus in business deals, it certainly makes the conduct of foreign relations between countries more difficult, because you don't know really what the other side's position is going to be. Even in Israel, you see that President Trump has made some turns away from the policy that he had announced earlier. For instance, that he will shift his capital from Tel Aviv to, he will shift the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and so on. So there have been shifts in policy at a very dizzying pace.
Yes.
And I think perhaps that's because there is really, at the moment, there doesn't appear to be a very kind of overarching view of how the US wants to conduct its relations with the rest of the world, except for the fact that they want to make America great again, put America first, get jobs for America, get business for America, and do deals which will, you know, benefit America. But relations between nations are always a two-way street.
Yes, yes.
Now you have to see where this goes. He is in Israel, and as you mentioned, he will also be meeting the Palestinian president, who he had also met some time back when the Palestinian president visited the United States. And he was quite surprised, actually, or he's reported to have been quite surprised at the relative openness of the Trump team, whereas the pre-election pronouncements had given the impression of a definite tilt.
Yes.
But like other US presidents before him, he has been compelled by the circumstances to move away from a totally partisan position if he hopes to, you know, have any role in brokering peace between Palestine and Israel.
Very quickly, I also want to, Suhasini, if you could very quickly tell me, because we're running short of time, how is Europe viewing this? Do they have a hand at all in anything that's going on? You know, are they just going to be watching how things progress eventually till their meetings, of course, take place?
I think the entire world is just waiting and watching and holding their breath because none of this is something they can deal with. Europe's first concern was really how Mr. Trump was going to view NATO and whether he was looking to pull out an American role from there. I think they have been assured on that score. However, they remain to see how the US is really going to deal with Russia, which has been their big concern for the last few years. And certainly, if it comes to some kind of a mediation role between Israel and Palestine, Europe will be very interested.
All right. Yes, very, very quickly, yes.
Well, I think one of the points that we need to keep in mind, and I want to extend the view from what Commodore Bhaskar said about Saudi-Pakistani relations. I think very importantly, we are forgetting that Saudi Arabia itself was looking for an opportunity to again claim its space in the Islamic world. You know, we must understand that US cannot work in a vacuum. I do see Suhasini's point of a more centrist, and mostly after getting elected, most US presidents and administrations, bar the odd ones after transition, sort out most of their things. But this has been a very partisan election, and Mr. Obama himself faced stiff partisan challenges. So the system was already polarized for the last, from Clinton time actually, and therefore I don't see this as a surprise. And I mean, I was expecting it, so I think we needed to have expected it. But I think Saudi attempt to garner regional support in all these years was also falling flat, and therefore, whether it was Pakistan, Turkey or Egypt, so they were waiting for a chance to bring the US back. And in the US perception of especially the Pakistani military coming to the rescue of, say, the Saudi regime, in case there is a regime threat, you know. So there are many calculations which may have been the reason why you saw the inputs from state or the NSA and others telling Mr. Trump and his immediate inner circle that you need to, you know, walk back. I mean, give your space back, because there are more interests involved in this, and we have a long game, and we are playing the long game here. So I think the role of Saudis, the political changes that the region has forced, and the Saudis' unease with the growing, let's say, support by Russians and China to Syria. You know, that also has been playing. And so that's the reason I see that they are pushing forward and they're willing to go extra mile. And of course, the GIC countries and others are willing to give money up front and say, okay, and they offered it to Obama as well, and then make these military purchases. And I think, so there's a lot of, you know, wins that he can spin back, as Uday said, back
Absolutely,
home.
but like we said, it's a long trip. There's a lot that
and
has
there's a
to
long
happen.
game.
Absolutely.
So
Thank you to all of you, of course, for joining me on this particular discussion, and we'll have many more definitely when it comes to Trump and his trip. Of course, meeting the Pope is always a good thing, but it's after that eventually the G7, EU and the NATO meets, which are probably going to be more interesting to watch, and we'll be carefully tracking that here on Rajya Sabha TV. But thank you so much for joining us here on The Big Picture for today. Thank you.